Thank you guys so much for being here, and I'm glad everybody got in. And I love this wonderful, wonderful occult book that was published in 1908, and the Hermetic, Greek, Egyptian, primeval wisdom that underscores the book. It's a book and a set of ideas that are so easy to underestimate, that are so easy to overlook. It's so easy to describe the Kybalion as kind of a novelty of occult publishing in the early 20th century. But as I've come to discover, probably just over the past year or so, there are beautiful, beautiful time capsules of ancient truths. Truths that go back many centuries older than I think we have fully understood in our critical age. And I say that not in some fantastical or wishful fashion, but I say it with deep seriousness, and I'll do what I can to be very specific with you about the magical, historical, Hellenic, Egyptian antecedents of this beautiful, beautiful book. It's more than a book. It's a living time capsule of ideas that connect us, however distantly and however thinly at times, however much the thread has gotten thin and frayed and broken. We really, really do have connections with some of our brothers and sisters going back to primeval Egypt, some of the earliest men and women who sought wisdom and who realized that there is an extra physical dimension to life, that life is not just making lists and harvesting crops and engaging in commerce and raising families, as important as all those things are, but that we are connected to a continuum of being that is greater than the flesh and blood that we experience ourselves as. And this, of course, is captured in the beautiful, beautiful Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, which is probably at the heart of the philosophy that you'll find in the Kybalion. And it fills me with such exuberance to talk about this, because we live in an age where it is, in fact, all too easy to engage about fantasies. You know, people have all kinds of ideas about hidden conspiracies and hidden hands and Illuminati, and figures like Alex Jones think this is all a big joke, it's all just an entertainment. But these things delude and they blind people, and they cement a kind of us versus them attitude in our culture, which is the last thing that we need today. And yet, for all this fantasizing and people getting lost in ruminations about an apocalypse or all kinds of far-out events and prophecies that are going to occur, we lose sight of actual real wonders, truly beautiful, fantastic things. And one of those fantastic things is that, as I was alluding a moment ago, we are not so greatly separate from the experiences of ancient people who themselves were seeking wisdom. Although, again, there's not a neat, continual family tree that can be drawn from deepest antiquity, from Mother Egypt up through today. History is messy. It doesn't go in straight lines. It goes in very, very crooked lines. There are precious, precious core samples of Egyptian thought that I think have come down to us today. And it's remarkable how life will hide. It's remarkable how wisdom will hide. And some of these truly beautiful, beautiful ideas got encapsulated between the covers of this lovely, lovely, short but epic book, the Kybalion, that was first published in 1908. I want tonight's talk to be many things, but above all things, I want it to be practical. So I want to start by asking you to do a very, very small exercise, and let me reassure you, it is an entirely private exercise. If there's one thing I don't like about the New Age culture, it's this overshare of intimacy that tends to go on within our environs. I love the New Age, don't get me wrong, and I apply that term to myself. I think of New Age as therapeutic spirituality. I think of it as a wonderful net good for the world, as a spiritual opening that over the past century or so has given people lots of options. But I could do without the oversharing of intimacy sometimes. You're entitled to your privacy. So this is an exercise that I'm going to ask you to do, but you're going to do it in private. I'd like you to think of something that you deeply, deeply want in life. And I'd like you to be very self-disclosing and unembarrassed about whatever that something is. I think another one of the traps that we sometimes get into today in our modern alternative spiritual culture is that we repurpose terms like non-attachment or identification or ego, and we use these things almost like catechism in a certain way to indicate what's right and what's wrong. We're supposed to be above wanting mere material possessions, or if we display some trait that we find unattractive in ourselves, we attribute it to personality. And if we display some trait that we find appealing in ourselves, we think, oh, that must be essence. You know, and I'm not sure that any of these divisions, attachment, non-attachment, essence, personality, consciousness, ego, awareness, inner, outer, I'm not sure any of these dichotomies actually exist. They're just words that we form a kind of consensus definition around, and we use them sometimes to limit ourselves. So when I say I want you to think of something that you really want in life, it doesn't have to be something that you think is spiritually or ethically pristine. It just has to be honest. It just has to be honest. Because having emotion at the back of something can direct and unleash tremendous energies, and it's very important to be honest with yourself about what you want. So just think about something, some one thing that you very, very deeply want in life, and this is your intimate idea. This is not something you have to share with the person sitting next to you or anybody. And I want you to be completely frank and honest with yourself. Because my hope is that as you listen to some of what is discussed this evening, you will make connections and find ways to apply some of the ideas that we're going to talk about, both here and afterward, to whatever this cherished thing is that you want. It's yours. Now, I had mentioned a few moments ago that it's easy, in a way, to dismiss a book like the Kybalion. And I have to confess to you that at one time earlier in my life, I came very close to dismissing it. I thought, based on a cursory reading, going back several years, that it was a book that contained some ideas from the New Thought or positive thinking tradition that were sort of dressed up in the dramatic garb of ancient Egyptian language, and that it was more or less a piece of theater, a novelty that got turned out of the occult culture of the early 20th century, where there were lots of novelties going on, and there continue to be today. I was turned off by the dramatic sounding byline of 3 initiates. I won't spend a great deal of time on this, but we know through documentation and historiography that the author of this book was a very, very lovely man named William Walker Atkinson, who was a New Thought writer, publisher, and philosopher in the early 20th century. Atkinson himself acknowledged his sole authorship in an entry in Who's Who in America in 1912. It was published by the Yogi Publication Society, which was Atkinson's publishing house in Chicago. Atkinson very commonly used pseudonyms in his work. 3 Initiates is his best-known pseudonym, but he also used Yogi Ramasharka, Theron Q. Dumont, my favorite, Magus Incognito, and his own name. He had a flair for the dramatic, and there was nothing wrong with that. And there have been rumors that have gone around for many, many years online that The great American occultist Paul Foster Case was one of the 3 initiates. I don't think that holds up at all, because although Paul Foster Case and William Walker Atkinson did in fact both live and work in Chicago at the same time, at the time of this book's publication, Paul Foster Case would have been 24 years old, and he didn't really start to turn out his own book-length efforts until about 10 years later. So it's not likely that he was of the literary pedigree at that time in his life that he would have been one of Atkinson's collaborators. Atkinson was an enormously prolific man, and he had no problem turning out literally about 100 New Thought-themed books by the time of his death in California in 1932. So all sources pointed to Atkinson's authorship, and I thought to myself, well, you know, this was just one of Atkinson's many projects in which he sort of took ideas from the New Thought tradition, from the tradition that teaches that thoughts are causative, from the tradition from which we draw concepts like the law of attraction, and he dressed it up in this ancient Greek Egyptian garb and issued it. It had some serviceable ideas, and that was that. I didn't really have much more of an appreciation for the book than just that. But life throws you these funny curveballs. And I got thrown a very strange curveball that returned me to the Kybalion. And this past summer, I read the book 5 times in a row consecutively. And I was absolutely enthralled with it. And I began to see that it had veritable connections to ancient Hermetic literature, which I will describe. That is a term in want of a definition, and we will get to it. And I could see that this book really did contain genuine, valuable, crystalline vestiges of what has come down to us of ancient Egyptian philosophy. And I was blown away. And I felt as if I had encountered this book for the first time, and all of my earlier opinions were immature, were not fully formed. And I have to admit to you, it's really strange how life will return us to things. And I want to tell you the plain story of how life returned me to the Kybalion. And I tell you this story with a short preface. The beautiful, beautiful spiritual teacher, Jiddu Krishnamurti, who I know many people in this room are familiar with, had an observation that has always put me in good stead. Krishnamurti said that the greatest barrier to your personal search and to your ability to discover and find things on your search and to succeed in your search, as well as in other areas of life, is the wish for respectability. That the wish for respectability is a terrible limiting barrier that puts a parameter on the individual's search, abilities, and true excellence. And that has become a kind of a guiding light to me, because the world that I come from is one in which people are not supposed to take seriously books like the Kybalion and ideas that come out of the New Thought tradition, or inspirational readings that you might have found on your grandmother's nightstand. I come from a world in which complexity and inscrutability and preparation are supposed to be the things that connote seriousness. But I've rejected that. I've rejected that. What connotes seriousness is the actual impact of a philosophy, is the actual success of a philosophy, is the manner in which a philosophy changes your conduct and your experience of life. Does it work is the only question that I honor approaching a philosophy. Does it work? Everything else is negotiable. I obviously want to see that a philosophy is not violent, that it has some ethical content, that it doesn't prohibit or block another individual from reaching his or her full potential. But if those questions can be answered in the affirmative, does it work, is the only question that I care about. So in that vein, I want to tell you the story, briefly, of how I came back to the Kybalion, and then what I discovered. I found, to my astonishment and delight, that a figure who some of you in this room may have grown up with, as I did, was a very great fan of this book, a very dedicated, serious, lifelong admirer of this book. And I am speaking of the comedic actor Sherman Hemsley, who played George Jefferson on The Jeffersons. I have this peculiar occult connection to the show The Jeffersons that I simply cannot explain. When I was in 5th grade, my classmates nicknamed me Mr. Bentley, after George's neighbor. You can't imagine what they were thinking. And the actress Marla Gibbs, who played the maid Florence on The Jeffersons, is actually very into science of mind. And I met Franklin Cover, the man who played the neighbor Tom Willis on The Jeffersons. He was a very nice man. He died in 2006, and his son, Bradford Cover, is a very distinguished stage actor. And I was at an off-Broadway show where Bradford was performing, and this woman came up to Franklin Cover very rudely. It's terrible being famous sometimes because people say really rude things to you. This woman comes up to him and said to him, "So are you doing anything today?" And he said, with such savoir-faire, "Well, nothing like this," you know, complimenting his son. You know, he was a good man. Anyway, I was researching the American New Thought movement, which I wrote about, among other places, in my book, One Simple Idea. And I came upon this astonishing story from TV Guide, which was actually referred to me by the scholar Philip Desley, who's a wonderful scholar of metaphysical movements. This was in 1982, when The Jeffersons was the hottest comedy in the country. Everybody was watching it. These were the days before the digital revolution, and to say a sitcom was popular was to say it went into, you know, almost every American home on the night that it was on. And here was one of the most popular shows in the country, and there was a portrait of Sherman Hemsley on the cover of TV Guide in 1982, and the headline read, "A rare look at the reclusive star of the Jeffersons. You'll never believe how he lives or what he believes." And I'm thinking, wow. I go into the article. The article talks very plainly and clearly about how Hemsley felt that the Kybalion had shaped his life and his career. He wouldn't name the book to the reporter. The reporter said something to him to the effect of, you know, how did you get your break? How did you break into theater? How did you break into television? And Hemsley, who was sort of mysterious, said, well, I met the man with the book, and it changed everything. And the reporter said he refused to specify what book. And he said, I guess sort of sounding like George, I don't want to advertise any book. But he had a housemate, Andre Pavin. And Andre confirmed to the reporter that the book was the Kybalion, and that Sherman had pressed it on him and said, you've got to read it, man. And he said he read it, and they read some other books, but he wouldn't say who the man was. He wouldn't say who the man was who gave him the book. But Andre confirmed that this book was the Kybalion. And this is in TV Guide, you know, we're talking about here. This wasn't, you know, Gnosis magazine or something. You know? And Hemsley had a reputation as something of a recluse. But he really wasn't a recluse. He was just a very private man. And the reporter asked him why he didn't hang around at Hollywood parties and restaurants. And Hemsley said, because nothing goes on there. The only exciting things go on in the mind. Which is something, a principle that could have come directly out of the Kybalion. So I get very attracted to ideas based on the personas who are behind them or are adjacent to them. And I thought to myself, this is such a real-world figure, and this is such a real-world example of a very non-conforming man who achieved a pinnacle of success, who felt that the Kybalion was the turning point in his life. And I thought to myself, why not go back and look at it again with fresh eyes, forgetting all the historiography and background and all the things that I think I know. Just read it again. And that was early last summer, and I never stopped reading it. I never stopped reading it. I was ignited with this excitement, not only at the quality of its ideas, but at their authenticity. And this is where I want to say a word about what is Hermeticism. What are the ideas that animate this book? Very simply put, in the decades immediately following the death of Christ, the city of Alexandria in Egypt was a place that was a crossroads of world culture. And there was a tremendous intermingling of African, Near Eastern, Middle Eastern, Greek, and Roman, some Indian cultures that met in Alexandria. It was a center of trade, it was a center of scholarship, it was a center of commerce, it was a center of religion. Now, Egypt at that time had been subjugated by the Roman Empire. But the people who served somewhat as the Roman administrators in Egypt, which at that time was under kind of military colonization by Rome, were Greek in nationality, although they self-identified as Egyptian. Cleopatra was Greek by nationality, but she self-identified as Egyptian, very much regarded herself as Egyptian, very much was Egyptian, insofar as she revived ancient Egyptian religion, temple orders, worship, things that were flourishing in the city of Alexandria in the decades immediately following Christ. So you had an administrative class that wrote and spoke in Greek, but that identified very, very deeply with Egyptian religion, history, iconography, mythology, worship, magic. And this Greek Egyptian literary class started to write down the ancient Egyptian ideas and philosophies in the Greek language. Now, Egypt's written language of hieroglyphs tended to be heavily symbolic. It eludes easy understanding, even today, in an age in which we almost expect that translation should open just about everything to us. But the truth is, translation doesn't open everything to us. For generations, our forebears read the King James Bible, taking certain things as verbatim fact. But as scholars go back and they compare the Aramaic texts to the Greek texts, to the Latin texts, they realize a lot has gotten lost, and debates still rage quite contentiously over the meaning of certain words and their context, even in books that are as familiar to us as the books of the Gospels, let's say. You can imagine how much more difficult it is to grasp a language that wasn't just this simple literary form of transmuted phonetics, but that was a language of symbol and meaning, filled with different layers within each hieroglyph and character. the Egyptian language of hieroglyphs didn't just disclose itself easily to translation, and it does not today. But you had this collection of Greek Egyptian scribes who, using the more conventional, in the Western sense, character-based, phonetically driven language of Greek, began to write down some of the ancient Egyptian teachings, some of which did not even exist in hieroglyphic form, but which were passed on in oral tradition, which was very, very common in Eastern, Near Eastern, and African cultures. Rather than signing their own names to these books of Egyptian magic, culture, and tradition that they began to write, they adopted another practice that was actually also quite common in the ancient world, which was to put the name of a venerated sage or god on the manuscripts as their author, because the manuscripts were in fact seen as conveying sacred, holy wisdom that was gained from some sort of extra-physical perception into the larger world. So the name that they used, that they often affixed to these manuscripts, was the name of Hermes, or more commonly, Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. That was a title, and this is very important, that was a title of veneration that the Greeks gave to Egypt's ancient god of writing and intellect, Tehuti Thoth. When the Greeks encountered the figure of Tehuti Thoth, who was the ibis-headed god, who's often pictured on temple walls and bas-reliefs with the body of a man, the head of an ibis, and holding a quill in his outstretched hand. Thoth, Egypt's ancient god of intellect, reason, communication, was such an awesome figure, such an awe-inspiring figure of veneration to the Greeks. And this god, this ancient god of writing, so predated by many centuries the Greek god of communication, Hermes, who later, of course, became the Roman Mercury, that they said, this is the antecedent to our own god, Hermes. He's 3 times as great as our Hermes. So the Greeks referred to Thoth, Egypt's god of writing and intellect, as Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes. The first time you find that phrase, at least in the history that we've recorded thus far, is in 172 BC. So these Greek Egyptian scribes would affix the name Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus to these magical, philosophical, religious tracts that they were writing down. And this became known as the Hermetica, or the Hermetic literature. Now, jumping ahead, and you'll forgive me, I have to make leaps in history because we only have 90 minutes, and there's only so much that can be done. But jumping ahead to the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. Here, we're moving centuries ahead. And within the Renaissance mind, there was this great hunger to rediscover the ancient world. And there was this belief that somewhere out there, in these ancient empires that were no more, that had vanished during the Dark Ages, must be evidence of some kind of primeval theology that predated everything else, that was known within the Judeo-Christian world. And one day, in the year 1460, a monk comes to the court of the Florentine leader Cosimo de' Medici, who was a big chieftain in Renaissance Florence at that time. And he has these Greek manuscripts that were discovered somewhere in the Byzantine world that are actual authenticated copies of the Hermetic literature, written in Greek, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, codifying ancient Egyptian religious, ethical, and magical ideas. And the leader, Cosimo, is absolutely shocked and delighted because he feels, and some of his court scholars feel, that this is evidence of this ancient primeval wisdom. And he has one of his primary translators, Marcello Ficino, discontinue translations of Plato and turn his attention to the Hermetic literature, which he translates from Greek into Latin. And he creates what is known today as the Corpus Hermeticum, which is a collection of books that comprise some of this ancient Hermetic literature. And to the Renaissance mind, this represented a body of ideas that could antedate Moses, that could stretch back to the time of Abraham, that spoke to this thirst for a primeval theology, something that predated everything else and from which the modern faiths grew out of. Now, later there was debate over the actual timeline of this Hermetic literature, and there were scholars who demonstrated that based on certain literary analysis, the literature had actually been written down in the decades following Christ. It didn't date back to latest antiquity. And because the timeline had to be rearranged and people's hopes that this Hermetic literature reflected something much older than the generations following Christ, because those hopes were challenged and dashed, eventually the Hermetic literature itself came to be seen as some sort of a fraud or a forgery or something that was chimerical, something that false fantasies and hopes had been attached to. And as the Renaissance gave way to the Age of Enlightenment, the Hermetic literature was viewed as something antiquated, compromised, inauthentic. People tended to view the Hermetic literature somewhat in the same way that years ago I had viewed the Kybalion as something that wasn't the real pristine wisdom that was sought, something that was an echo, that was imitative, that was mimicry. And this was a tremendous mistake that was made, I think, in the Western intellectual mindset that is actually slowly being redressed today. Because what scholars and translators failed to appreciate was this. Although the Hermetic literature itself, this ancient Egyptian literature, was written down in Greek in what we would consider late antiquity, in the centuries following Christ, although it was written down post-Christian era, it was based upon an oral tradition that itself had roots that may truly have gone back to a primeval Egyptian theology that the Renaissance mind was so hungry for. How do we know this? We know this because most of our ancient literature today, Homer, Plato, what you'll find in Scripture, the Vedas, the Dhammapada, the Tao Te Ching, most of this literature had its start in a form that predated written language that was oral in nature. Most tradition, most myths, most ancient dramas, most ancient philosophy, and you can find depiction of this in the Socratic dialogues themselves, began in oral form. That was its antecedent. There's no reason, based on consistency, to suppose that the Hermetic literature was some kind of schismatic exception to that. Now, you also find evidence in the Hermetic literature of other influences, Neoplatonic influences, early Christian influences, influences that come from some Greek philosophical schools, as well as influences that come from ancient Egypt. It is no easy job and no plain job to sort out where one influence begins and another ends. It's a mosaic. It's a melange. Ideas, like history, do not travel along straight lines. There's an intermingling. There's an intermixture. So the Hermetic literature represents, as you would expect, literary and intellectual and religious influences from its era. Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, all kinds of different strains of thought that were crisscrossing through Alexandria at the time. But there is without question, a spine of Egyptian magical philosophy that runs through this literature and that represents a core sample and a very, very precious sounding of Egyptian oral tradition that has been preserved to us in fragments and set down in Greek literary form. And as I was rereading the Kybalion, I found an extraordinary crisscrossing of correspondences between the thought that exists in this book and the thought that exists in the Hermetic literature that's come down to us today. And that's why this is a book of such great and beautiful value. But its value can be measured only in your lived experience, in the degree to which these ideas play out in your life, because they are meant to be ideas that are useful, that are impactful, that are applicable. So let's talk about the ideas that are actually found in the Kybalion and what it would mean to use them. There are 7 principles in this book, and I want to walk through each one of the 7. Some I'm going to walk through very, very quickly. Some I'm going to spend more time on because I think they're more practical. The first principle is that all the universe is mental. And the supporting idea for that contention is the famous Hermetic principle, as above, so below. That's found in a manuscript that's called the Emerald Tablet, that is not very often grouped with the traditional Hermetic literature. The reason it's not grouped with the Hermetic literature is that for a long time it was thought to be a forgery that was just created in the medieval period. But actually in the early 20th century, scholars found Arabic versions of the Emerald Tablet, which went back to at least late antiquity, the 700s or the 800s, which suggests that there probably was an earlier source, because a great deal of Hermetic thought got preserved not only in Greek and to a lesser extent in Latin, but also in Arabic. The Hermetic Tablet has the famous lines, "True without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is as that which is below." So the author of the Kybalion, using that reasoning as his jumping off point, goes into a rather extensive argument that comes down to this. The very fact that you can picture in your mind worlds, possibilities, sensations, physicalities, suggests that the creative faculties that you use to bring things into actuality, if one uses as above, so below, as a kind of guiding precept, suggest that everything that exists begins as a thought. That ultimate substance is thought. That when we say spiritual, we are fixing a phrase to thought in its finest and most pristine form. As above, so below. That life is composed of concentric circles, and that whatever is experienced in one of those circles is necessarily experienced in an infinite chain of circles that extend all the way to a place that might be called the all. And the all would be considered an infinite universal mind, whose framework we are embedded within. We are figments within. In the same way that Hamlet is a figment of Shakespeare, so we are a figment of something higher. If we follow this hierarchical principle, this symbiotic hierarchical principle of as above, so below. A great mind controls all. The universe is mental. That's the first principle of the Kybalion. The second principle of the Kybalion is that all is in vibration. Everything vibrates. It's an interesting observation because this being written as it was in 1908 and drawing upon literature that was itself ancient to the point that it's difficult to actually define, you could have a discussion with a quantum physicist today, and he or she would agree, yes, everything is in vibration to the extent that we understand that particle science is such that particles are in a state of superposition. They only are at a fixed point on the subatomic scale when somebody attempts to take a measurement. There does seem to be a law of universal movement that prevails on the subatomic level. And the Kybalion, for its purposes, uses this insight to suggest that life is permeable. If all is mental, then there is a permeability to life. Then things are not as fixed in circumstance or physicality or solid matter as they seem to be. There is constant movement, there is constant change, and according to the law of as above, so below, there is a principle of mutability, of transformation, of metamorphosis, of change that is constantly at work in our world. The author's use of the term vibration could be defended in terms of the hard sciences, but it's not necessary to defend. You could say, think of it as a metaphor. Think of it as a metaphor. If you prefer a word like mutability to vibratory, use the term mutability. That's the principle that he's getting at. All is in vibration. All is changing. Everything is dynamic. And because of the nature of mind, mind is a factor in this dynamism. The third principle is the law of correspondence, which is just really another sounding of the principle of mentalism, as above, so below. Everything is interrelated. Everything that you experience is intimately linked to something else. It's impossible to talk about any unit of life, any unit of reality, any unit of experience as unattached to and unaffected by a symbiotic universe that surrounds it. Change one thing and you're changing everything. Change one thing in your life and it could have ripple effects that are extraordinary and unforeseeable. William James used to talk about that. He used to say that if you make one act of moral volition, resisting a habit, or not engaging in an act of gossip, or spreading or listening to a rumor, you have no idea the network of possibility that you might be tapping into. So this is the third Hermetic principle that you'll find in the Kybalion. Correspondences. Everything relates. Everything relates. I remember years ago I had a spiritual teacher who had encouraged me to write a conciliatory letter to my father. My father and I had had kind of a rupture. And he said to me, look, you know, if you write this letter, this conciliatory letter to your father, you have no idea what kinds of possibilities it might fertilize. You have no idea what the results may be. Maybe you have a whole chain of ancestry that this problem that you're having with your father is merely symptomatic of. And maybe, if you write this conciliatory letter to your father, maybe it will work its way backwards through an entire network of your ancestors, solving a problem, healing a rupture. You don't know that it won't. I took his advice and I did write that letter. And I don't have any way of knowing to what extent it fertilized other possibilities. But I always look back on that moment in my life as having been one where I did the very best I was capable of doing. I know that that's not something I'll have to look at as a piece of unfinished business when I come to the end of the road. That story, I think, fits fairly well within this third Hermetic principle of correspondences. Everything is related. So we never know, and never can know, how an act will reverberate. It gives you a sense of the power that you might have. Just imagine if you refuse to listen to or spread a piece of gossip about somebody. You could be saving a life. I mean that in the plainest sense. You could be saving a life. People have no idea the power that they possess. That's what's inherent in this Hermetic law of correspondences. Everything is interconnected. The fourth Hermetic law, and this is very important, is the law of polarity. The law of polarity. I think this may be the most crowning practical idea found in the Kybalion, and in a certain sense, I almost see everything in the book as a preface and an epilogue to this one idea, this idea of polarity. The concept is this, that everything in life belongs to a kind of sliding scale. And every emotion that you experience is simply the furthest point, or a point on that scale, that relates to an equal and opposite point. So, for example, fear and courage are part of a sliding scale. Love and hate are part of a sliding scale. Enthusiasm and boredom are part of a sliding scale. Depression and exuberance are part of a sliding scale. And the insight of this fourth Hermetic principle of polarity is that you actually have the capacity to change an emotional experience that you are having to its polar opposite. As above, so below. And the way that you change this emotional experience to its polar opposite is by directing your will to the opposite principle and quality. So, for example, if you're feeling fearful of something, whatever it may be, and you use every moral and emotional resource available to you, understanding that fear is the opposing polarity of courage, and you concentrate not on killing fear, but on cultivating courage, you will actually experience a sliding of the scale, a swinging of the pendulum, so to speak, from cowardice to courage. That's the contention of this principle of polarity. You see it all the time. People have feelings of profound love for somebody, and then they hate this person. When someone is found murdered, who's the first suspect? The person who's closest to them. The person who's closest to them. The dentist's wife is found murdered on Dateline. You know, who is always the killer? The dentist, you know. And the police will tell you this. It's the first thing they do. When they find a murder victim, the first thing they do is they say, okay, who was the person closest to this individual? And 9 times out of 10, they've got the perpetrator. 9 times out of 10. Passions are all on a sliding scale. And the contention, and it takes work, and it takes effort. And I don't want you to be discouraged if you try it and it doesn't work, because this is our lives. I mean, these are things that have been cemented into us since our earliest days. It shouldn't be easy. But the contention is that everything has its polar opposite. And this is true not just in our emotional lives, but it's true physically as well. hot and cold and parched and aquified, gaseous and solid. Depending upon changes in conditions, things will change to their opposite. But what you must watch for is this. You have to pinpoint what is the opposite of this actual state. You can't change something to a thing that's outside of its category. So, for example, you can't change depression to baloney. That does not work within the cosmic framework that we have to function within. But you can change depression to exuberance. You cannot change something that is completely unrelated into some imagined opposite form. A mineral can't be changed into a bird. Okay? But if you can locate within yourself or within physical life the polar opposite of a thing, an emotion, an experience through some kind of alchemical operation, which can be physical or which can be emotional, you can, by a concentration of will and an application of cause and effect steps, slide that scale. Slide that scale. That is the contention. That is the contention. So again, you would have love on one end of the polar scale. You would have hate on the other end of the polar scale. You would have a variety of degrees in between. The contention is that because everything that is a thing is composed of polarities, you can, through alchemical, physical, psychological, emotional means, transform things into their opposite. You have that power. You have that ability. It requires tremendous effort, exercise, trial and error, but it exists. That's the contention of the chapter of the principle of polarity. That is principle 4. Principle 5 is rhythm, which relates very closely to the principle of polarity. Rhythm is really, in some respects, a restatement of the principle of polarity. It's the idea that life is pendulous. Life is pendulous, and circumstances change. And there is a constant dynamic change going on. And you can use one law against another law to benefit from these changes. If you are feeling happy about something, it is a fact of life based on the law of rhythm, according to principle number 5, that eventually, sometimes abruptly, the pendulum is going to swing from happiness to sorrow or anxiety. But the principle of rhythm also holds that if you can become an observer of this principle, become aware of and observant of this principle, you can allow the pendulum to swing on a kind of lower, lesser principle of life, and you can, through an act of will, elevate your own thoughts so that you are observing but not taken by the pendulum swing. So you're in one state, and you know, based on the law of rhythm, this state is going to get away from you as the tides ebb and flow, as the sun sets and rises, as frost gives way to spring, as spring gives way to summer, summer to fall. It's natural, it's seasonal, it's cyclical. It's part of our lives. It's part of the cosmic framework that we exist within. So as we experience seasonal change, we also experience emotional change. The rhythms of emotions are ever present. They cannot be avoided, but they can be observed. And if you observe the pendulum swing within yourself, let it swing. Don't try to fight it. It's a natural law. It has to occur. Let it swing, just like the wind blows. You don't fight the wind, but you observe it. You observe it. And if you observe it, you can observe it occurring on a lower iteration of your life while you stay elevated and act in the part of observer. This is very, very important. It's important for all people, frankly. It's very important for people who are of an artistic temperament, because I think it is indelible and basic to the artist that these rhythmic changes are very keenly and intensively felt. And they shouldn't be fought. That's part of what gives the artist his or her temperament. It's necessary. The artist is blessed with feeling things with a certain degree of intensity. Many, many people have observed that there is this kind of rhythmic, pendulous swing that goes on with a great intensity in the artistic personality. It's necessary, it's natural, it's right, it's good, it fosters creation, but it can also be painful. It can also be painful. The idea is not to get away from it and not to fight it. It is to observe it and try to occupy a sphere of life. And there are higher spheres of life within us, just as there are within the physical universe, as above, so below, from which we can observe things and not feel that the totality of ourselves is taken with the swing, the rhythmic swing. So that is principle number 5, rhythm. Principle number 6 is the principle of cause and effect. Cause and effect. The idea behind this principle is that everything in life is lawful in a certain sense. Everything in life has some antecedent, some cause. Even if you will discover symmetries in life. If you take a coin and you flip it X number of times, eventually heads and tails will even out. It's the kind of thing we're apt to look at and say, well, big deal, so what? Well, it's rather extraordinary because it demonstrates on the simplest level that there is a lawful, predictable outcome within the cosmic framework that we live within. It's literally impossible that if you take a penny and flip it over 10,000 times, you'll come up with 10,000 heads or 10,000 tails. It's impossible. Nor is it even possible that you will deviate more than a very few points from a 50-50 outcome. Why would that be? Why would that be? Why shouldn't you get 10,000 heads or 10,000 tails or 9,000 heads? I mean, if you were even to get 6,000 of one side, if you did 10,000 flips, the odds would be astronomically slender that such a thing could ever happen. It would violate all known laws. And yet, even that simple example demonstrates that there is a cause and effect at work behind circumstance in this world that we live in. The question is determining what that cause and effect is. It's not always easy to make that determination, and it's not always possible to make that determination. Sometimes a cause may go back to antiquity. I mean, why are we sitting here tonight talking about Hermeticism? Some of our brothers and sisters could have been sitting in an Egyptian temple in the era of Cleopatra in the city of Alexandria, literally, in whatever tongue they were speaking, having the same conversation, and maybe somebody said, you know, we ought to write this down. You know, ask Julius, he'll write it down. You know, maybe that's why we're talking tonight. You know, I have no idea. But the notion of Principle 6, cause and effect, is that nothing is random, nothing is coincidental, nothing is happenstance, nothing is purely accidental. Everything follows some timeline of events that makes the outcome the only possible outcome that could have happened. The question is, have we the perspective to see what that timeline is and to get involved in it? Sometimes we do. Sometimes you can use these laws to actually change an outcome. Sometimes we don't have the perspective. The series of events are too vast, too epic, too ancient. Or perhaps we just don't have all the information that's at hand. I'm absolutely awestruck at the paucity of facts that I have in my life. Now, I want to make a judgment call about something. I have some attitude about someone's behavior. And I'm so completely bereft of facts. I am really just operating off of a script that's based upon things that I've thought or done previously in life. And that script, if I really stop to look at it, is terrifyingly limited. Almost all of my responses to things in life seem to be about one of 20 things. It's absolutely terrifying. We think of ourselves as these free beings, but almost everything I do in life comes down to 1 out of 20 choices. Almost always with very few facts bearing upon my choices. Rather, I am reading off of a psychological script that I've written based upon attitudes or temperament or things that were formed very early in me. And as if I have 20 stick-em notes up on the wall, I'm taking down one of my stick-em notes. Oh, here's where I'm indignant. Here's where I'm afraid. Here's where I, try to be intimidating. Here's where I do this. Here's where I avoid, And there's only about 20 stick-em notes on that wall. And it's terrifying to think of, because we're filled with these possibilities. And we live in a universe where everything has this grand cause and effect behind it. And rather than seeking facts, I take down one of my stick-em notes. So again, there are times where cause and effect cannot be known, where the facts just might not be available to us. But at least let's hold the question. At least let's hold the question. Let's realize that with this sixth Hermetic law, the law of cause and effect, we're told there is an orderly progression of events. The flipping of a coin itself teaches us that. So if there's an orderly progression that we can see in an example like that, again, as above, so below, that example can be writ more largely in other areas of our lives if only we could see it. If only we can see it. It may not be given to us to see it. There might be 100 facts that we need to know, and we might have only 10. But let's at least hold the thought that we don't know. Hold the question. Hold the question. We don't know the factors that are going on behind something. We think we do, but that's a trap. We don't. And the Hermetic principle of cause and effect tells us that we don't. That things don't just happen, and they don't just belong to that script that I've reduced to stick-em notes on my wall, and I take them down when I want a response. There's something much more going on. What is it? Hold that question. And the seventh and final Hermetic principle that the book explores is the principle of mental gender. Mental gender. That we are all within us, and nature, the cosmos, everything that is, has within it masculine and feminine principles. Masculine and feminine principles. The world and all that exists stands on this principle. This idea that you have to have an intermingling of a masculine and feminine principle and some kind of a reconciling result. Some kind of a reconciling result. The example that the author of the Kybalion uses is this, and these are just metaphors, that the conscious mind, the list-making mind, the thinking mind, the mind that says, I'm going to walk over here and pick up this cup, and oh no, I don't want to do that because I'll rattle the ice, and then I'll mess up the live stream, so I'll leave the cup there. That mind, he would call the masculine principle. The subconscious mind, the mind that creates, the mind that actually gives birth to the creative idea, he refers to as the feminine principle. And that if properly directed by will, which the author sees as a kind of life essence, that almost as the all stands above known reality, the will in you stands above known reality in your life. This thing that he calls the will can direct the masculine principle, the thinking, list-making mind, that the kind of functional, everyday, problem-solving mind, can direct that masculine principle to transmit ideas, intentions, notions to the subconscious mind, the feminine principle, which is the mind that ultimately creates, that ultimately gives birth. As above, so below. if we can picture things and create them on whatever scale we exist on, and you can imagine that extending into this enormous, concentrically formed cosmic framework in which all is mental, the mind represents creative capacities and possibilities, but it has to be used correctly. The masculine, in a certain sense, makes suggestion to the feminine, the subconscious, which holds it in a womb-like state of possibility, and the reconciling force is that which actually results, the creative thing that you want to make, that you are capable of making, as we have been made by the all, the higher, the great mind, nous, as the Greeks referred to it, the overmind, the oversoul, as Ralph Waldo Emerson referred to it. So there you have the 7 Hermetic principles. Each of them a creation, I think, of insights from modern traditions, psychology, New Thought, different forms of contemporary metaphysics, but all of them based and traceable to the great Hermetic literature. If you want to read some of the Hermetic literature, I'm going to suggest to you 3 short works that are easy to find and that will really, I think, give you everything that we have been talking about tonight. First of all, you have to find a decent translation of the Hermetic literature. A translation that I particularly like is from Princeton University Press by Brian Copenhaver. But there are other translations that you can find online. G.R.S. Mead is spelled M-E-A-D, published a translation in 1906, 2 years before the Kybalion came out, and you can find that online. It's not one of my favorite translations. He was a beautiful, beautiful scholar and a visionary, but it's marked, I think, by a kind of somewhat turgid, thick Victorian prose or post-Victorian prose. It's not one of my favorites, but it's serviceable. It's serviceable. The publisher Inner Traditions publishes a very, very good translation called The Way of Hermes. And there are more coming. The Hermetic literature is being rediscovered. But you can take your pick from various versions that you can find, and the Mead is very easy to find online, and it's serviceable. I want to recommend 3 Hermetic books to read. And when I say books, these things are really what we today would consider pamphlet-sized in length. They're very, very short. But if you read these 3 works, you will see how they relate to the Kybalion. You will see this continuum that I've been describing between ancient or late ancient Egyptian thought and the ideas in the Kybalion. The first book to read is sometimes called the Divine Pymander of Hermes Trismegistus. Pymander is a Greek-Egyptian word that means shepherd or shepherd of men. In short, it's book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It's the first book. It's very, very beautiful. And you can find it in a variety of places. It's sometimes called Poimandres, which is just another Hellenic variation of the term Pymander. The Divine Pymander of Hermes Trismegistus. Book 1 of the Corpus Hermeticum. It's very easy to find. The other book to read is Book 11 of the Corpus Hermeticum. Book 11. The reason I single that out is because that book, and again it's very short, in translation it amounts to maybe 4 pages, maybe 6. That book talks about the powers of mind and how the mind of the individual is imitative of the mind of the higher, or nous, the higher mind, the all-creating force, the all-enveloping force. And you will get a wonderful, wonderful capsule lesson in the dynamics of mind as understood by the Hermetic Egyptians in Book 11 of the Corpus Hermeticum. And finally, the third book that I encourage you to read is called Asclepius. Asclepius. It's a book that is not traditionally grouped with the Corpus Hermeticum, but it's very easy to find. The reason it's not grouped with the Corpus Hermeticum is that its original Greek source has not been found. It came down to us only in Latin, but there are Greek fragments of it. So it's considered to be of the same vintage as the other Hermetic books. It's a very, very beautiful dialogue, and it will make you cry because not only is it filled with wonderful ideas, but it's a prophecy of Egypt's decline. It's a prophecy of Egypt's decline. In fact, the epigraph of my book, Occult America, is taken from Asclepius, and it reads, "O Egypt, Egypt, thy religion will be reduced to only fables." And it prophesies Egypt's decline under Roman domination. It's a very, very beautiful book, filled with ideas, filled with ideas. But embedded within that prophecy is also a foresight of the revival of the ancient gods, the revival of the ancient gods. And I want to close tonight on that note. You know, sometimes all this talk of using the agencies of the mind can be very frustrating to people because the truth is, and I go through this myself and I go through it all the time, there are periods where we are defeated by personal crisis, by emotional anguish, by depression, by disappointment, by sorrow. And let me tell you, when you are in a state where you have suffered a crushing disappointment, or where you just feel so burdened by the habits or the addictions or the mood swings that are part of life, that you don't want to hear, I don't want to hear somebody saying, well, you know, time to slide that polarity back to the, happy side of life, And we feel instinctively and correctly, that there are times where that is simply not possible, where disappointment, physical pain, emotional pain, loss, grief, or just the ennui of daily existence have got us in a grip. And what to do at such times? Well, we talked about the law of rhythm. Yes, you can count on the fact that there will be a pendulum swing, and that's true. But there may be times where that pendulum swing seems very far away. There may be times at 4 o'clock in the morning where you can't sleep, where I can't sleep. And talk of pendulum swings is not a very warming sensation. And I understand that. And in that regard, I do feel very strongly, that appeals can be made to higher forces, that prayer and appeals to the higher represent a real and potent possibility when I feel crushed by just the emotions of life that are inevitable. And some of us feel these emotions more intensely than others. Those of an artistic temperament feel these emotions with a terrible intensity sometimes. And I want to invite you into a personal experiment. And again, this is your personal experiment. If you want to write to me about it, write to me about the results, you're very welcome to. You don't have to. There's no card where you have to write down what happened to you and share it with anybody, or turn to the person sitting next to you and share what happens. Let me ask you this question. What if the ancient Greeks were correct? They were right about a lot of things. What if when they encountered ancient Egypt's god of wisdom, Thoth, and they were driven to their knees and said, this being is 3 times as great as our Hermes or Mercury? What if they were absolutely correct? What if you could make a direct appeal to Thoth, Hermes, Trismegistus? People pray all the time. Ours is a praying culture. What if the ancient gods have been neglected? What if they hunger for our veneration? What if they hunger for your veneration in a world that has forgotten them? Read the dialogue of Asclepius, this beautiful, beautiful, bittersweet, crying dialogue that accurately prophesies the decline and disappearance of ancient Egypt and its lexicon of gods. What if the ancient gods are lonely? What if you, by reaching out to the ancient gods, would find yourself in a position of giving hallowed comfort to an ancient entity that still exists? Is there some rule somewhere that says we can only put a certain name or names or even a universal label on the higher? The Greeks venerated Thoth. The Egyptians venerated Thoth. Maybe you should go home tonight with these principles in mind, with the thought in mind that I asked you to form at the beginning of this evening's presentation, and make a direct appeal to Hermes Trismegistus or Thoth Hermes. See what happens. Try it as a personal experiment. You're here because you have an interest in ethical and spiritual philosophies. If you're a hardened atheist, don't do it. Don't waste your time. But if you are a person of belief, if you are a spiritual seeker, who am I to stand here and say that the ancient Egyptians, whose empire existed for thousands of years, whose empire existed centuries and centuries and centuries longer than what we call Western civilization? When Herodotus wrote of the pyramids were as ancient to him as he is to us, literally. Who am I to say that this empire that existed for thousands of years had a misconception of the higher, of the holy, of the sacred? Maybe these beings and entities still exist and hunger for the veneration of their children. We've been withholding it for centuries, perhaps. This is just an experiment. You don't have to join anything, and you don't have to tell anybody. They'll probably think you're crazy, so it's a better idea not to. But if you're moved by the idea, and if you take seriously the concept of an intimate, personal, spiritual search, hand in hand with what we've discussed tonight about this beautiful book, the Kybalion, with what you've formulated intimately to yourself about that which you wish for, if you're so moved, make a personal plea to the ancients. Asclepius, the Hermetic book, not only prophesizes Egypt's decline and disappearance, it prophesizes its rebirth. Maybe that's what's brought us together tonight. Maybe that's what we're here for. So I send you with that hope, with that wish for your highest fulfillment and development. Thank you so much. Thank you. I know we're running late. Do we have time for some questions and answers?
A few.
A few?
Probably.
Okay. Anybody? Thoughts, questions? Hey.
Hi. The principle of vibration.
Yeah.
If I recall, the book goes into a lot of detail about many layers and layers and layers
Yes.
and layers. And at one point, it just gets a little
Yes.
intense.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I just wanted to see your thoughts on
Oh, that's
what your...
wonderful question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. You're very correct. That is a turgid section of the book. And I've had a number of people come to me and say, man, I have tried to read the Kybalion and I get stuck at that point. And I think probably one of the reasons the author, William Walker Atkinson, a.k.a. Three Initiates, wrote it that way was this. First, he was very influenced by Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophy tradition, and he was very taken with Madame Blavatsky's cosmology and the secret doctrine. And the secret doctrine is nothing if not verbose in matters of cosmology, and I think he felt it brought seriousness to the book if he really explored the idea of these different corresponding levels of reality and how the vibrations of one affect the other. I think he felt it lent gravitas to the book. I think, frankly, he overdid it. On only the thinnest of principle do I find a correspondence between that and the Hermetic literature. What you've identified is the part of the book that I think mostly came from him, from his own kind of conceptions of the universe and authorial ambitions. Now, I've done something that some people would consider sacrilege, but that I did with great love and dedication. I recently published, and this is on audio at the moment, an audio condensation of the Kybalion, and I talk about how I've tried to distill the book down to its most practical principles, not neglecting anything, but going more quickly over portions such as that one, which I think were more reflective of the author as a contemporary individual than of the ancient philosophy that he was embodying. I think there are some people who feel, look, you shouldn't reduce anything out of the Kybalion, it's all necessary. But I have had people come to me and raise that exact point and say that has been a barrier to them in entering the book. And I always tell them, well, don't let it be a barrier. It has its own internal logic. You mustn't get hung up on it. It's a short book, it's a turgid section, but it's all of 20 pages. Just get through it. But I do think that that's not one of the points where the book shines at its brightest. That's my opinion. Yeah. Anybody else? Hey.
What's the link between William Walker Atkinson and the Hermetic texts in the chain of events?
Yeah, great question. Best I can tell, he wrote the earliest portions of this book. You can find vestiges of their ideas in his work going back to 1903. He seems to have written the final passages of the book in 1907. He published it in 1908. So he had a limited range of sources to work from. He had to work from a handful of Victorian-era translations. He probably benefited from the translation that was published in 1906 by G.R.S. Mead, which I mentioned earlier. There was a British occultist named Anna Kingsford, and she had a partner, Edward Maitland. They published a book on the ideas of Hermes in 1885 called Virgin of the World. I think he probably imbibed some of the ideas from that book, which came basically a generation earlier. He had that book to work from, he had theosophical literature to work from, and he had a handful of Victorian translations of varying quality to work from, and one English translation that was made in about 1650. And that's pretty much what he had to work from. Unless you speak ancient Greek, which I do not believe he did, he had to work from those English translations. So that's what he had, pretty much. Yeah. Anybody else? Hey.
I don't know. I feel like maybe I missed something, but the law of cause and effect, for me, feels intuitively a little bit in conflict with the law of polarity and correspondence.
Uh-huh.
Because in some ways the law of polarity, the way I understood it, feels very empowering.
Yes, right.
Whereas the law of cause and effect limits that power.
I see, right.
So it's almost like there's a push and pull between the two.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. He probably would say that push and pull is an example of the very polarity that he's talking about, that everything, is set in tension in life. And he did say that we as individuals, you said one law feels kind of empowering and the other feels somewhat limiting in a certain sense. He did say that we do function under limits, that we as individuals do have to function into a cosmic framework where, for example, there is physical decay. And even though everything is mind, we are figments of a mental creation that nonetheless have to experience as real those things that have been set down within our cosmic framework. So he would say that we have unbelievable abilities to become much greater than what we think we can be, but we do still function under certain limitations, parameters, and laws within this cosmic framework. And he would probably say, I think your intuition is absolutely correct. I think he would say that the limits that you're sensing are inherent in an idea like cause and effect are in fact right, that we do experience certain limits. Physical decline being
it's like
one.
We're playing the playground, but we're limited by the bounds of the playground.
I think he would say you're right. I think he would say you're right. And it's a tough thing to wrestle with because we want to feel that we're part of the intimate, the infinite. And he would say you are part of the infinite, you are part of the infinite, but you're part of it in an act of becoming. You still have to function within the sphere or the playground that we're within. I think you're right. Hey.
Doesn't that relate to holding the tensions of the opposites?
Yes. I mean, the idea of polarity is that an emotion, an experience, a thing can be transformed to its opposite, but it can't be transformed to something that's completely outside of the sliding scale that it belongs to.
No, but what I'm referring to is that when you've got these tensions, when you have these tensions within you,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not acting out, you're allowing both of these dynamics to live.
Yes.
And a third thing comes through.
He would say, first of all, that there's always going to be a rhythmic motion between the two tensions, but that, yes, you have one that can be, he said that gender is a basic law of life, mental gender, physical gender, cosmic gender, and that these opposing things that you're experiencing that are in tension will give birth to some reconciling thing. Yes, that's absolutely right. That's part of the workings of the laws he outlines. Yeah, yeah. Cool, great. Anybody else? We good? Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.